Facebook has already made the controversial decision to not fact check political ads, not fact check speech from politicians. What's your take on this now sort of middle ground, saying, well, you can turn off political ads if you don't want to see them?
Well, thanks for having me, Emily. I think the truth is it's not much of a middle ground. What it's doing is putting the onus on the user to do the work. They're saying we won't provide any fact checking or really almost any standards whatsoever on our platform. But you, the user, can click on a few buttons and opt out if you make that decision. The thing I think is really key here is that advertising is a relatively small fraction of the content that a person encounters on Facebook or on Instagram, or for that matter on Twitter, in a given session. And they've made very clear they have no intention of doing anything about disinformation or hate speech or targeted abuse on the organic content that's shared, that again represents the vast majority of what you're going to see every time you go to Facebook. So, this is them saying, we're not doing anything about disinformation. If you don't like ads from politicians, whether or not they're truthful, you can opt out. But there's nothing preventing you from getting a piece of disinformation shared to you from a friend or a neighbor. So the core problem with the platform sort of persists.
Interesting to note, this announcement about political ads was kind of a footnote at the end of an op-ed in USA Today written by Mark Zuckerberg, where they were announcing a new voter registration campaign. Zuckerberg writing, for those of you who've already made up your minds and just want the election to be over, we hear you. So we're introducing the ability to turn off seeing political ads, and we will still remind you to vote. Facebook, Zuckerberg saying their goal with this new voting information campaign is to get 4 million people registered to vote. I wonder, that's great, but are they missing the real problem?
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, I like you just sort of hinted at, I'm glad they're going to register voters. I hope they register 4 million and more, and I hope they do voting reminders and let people know how to vote. And this is an election in which a lot of people may wind up having to vote by mail, many for the first time because of COVID. So I really hope that they contribute constructively to letting people know how to do that, what the deadlines are, if you need to pay for your own postage or not, all that kind of stuff, which can have a really big impact on whether people actually do it or not. But again, I think, advertising is just a relatively small piece of the overall Facebook ecosystem. So they're letting you say, I don't want to hear from Donald Trump, I don't want to hear from Joe Biden, but they're doing nothing about the things that you're going to hear organically from your friends, your family, your neighbors. They're also, I think it's important to note, doing nothing about all the other actors in the political ecosystem who aren't actually campaigns or interest groups. So, for example, Breitbart is obviously a quite notorious news website or right-wing news website. They are not classified as a political group, so they could still advertise something into your feed. So it essentially changes the makeup of the political content that a person is going to receive on Facebook or on Instagram. It doesn't necessarily do anything about information. In fact, disinformation. It probably doesn't do anything about disinformation. It just allows a few users to say, I want to hear less from candidates themselves. But I think it's a problem for the democracy, a problem for the whole political discourse. If a truthful ad from Joe Biden, a person can opt out of that, but a piece of disinformation from some crazy uncle, a person can't opt out of that. You run the risk that you're actually worsening the overall mix of information and disinformation that a person receives on Facebook or on Instagram.
Interesting. Now, as a person who ran the digital side of President Obama's re-election campaign, you know how important a platform like Facebook is. I mean, do you think this will materially impact the ability for President Trump, Vice President Joe Biden to reach voters for this election? Yes is the answer. I think it's a little, it's going to be interesting to see how many people actually use this. If you look at Facebook, put out a blog post late last night where they explained how you actually go through the process of opting out. It's not the most intuitive thing in the world. It's a couple of clicks. It's not, as I understand it, going to be a big banner that says opt out. So you kind of have to find the button, click, get a menu of options, click again. My guess is that not all that many people avail themselves of it. It matters who does, though. I was talking to a friend earlier who said, the kinds of people that campaigns desperately need to reach are the kinds of people who are often most fed up with politics. And so, if it is the case that the undecided voter or perhaps the sort of demobilized voter who either campaign is going to try to be reaching, if it's the case that they're the ones who are most likely to use this tool, then that's a big deal for campaigns in both parties. The other thing I think is really important to note, we're also obsessed with the White House, and understandably so, given the person who's in it. But this doesn't just affect Donald Trump and Joe Biden. This affects people running for state house. This affects people running for dog catcher. This affects people running for mayor. This could affect local interest groups that are trying to do something, good in their community. And essentially, I think what it's going to do is sort of hamstring anybody who doesn't already have an audience. Donald Trump is going to probably be just fine on Facebook. He's got tens of millions of followers. He's got huge organic reach, and he's obviously got a whole disinformation network supporting him from both the United States and abroad. If you're someone who is inspired by the protests or fed up with the government's handling of COVID-19 or something like that, and you're trying to get something, start something new and either run for office or start some policy initiative, a Facebook ad is a huge part of the way that you would grow an audience and get traction. And this is going to affect them too. So I think it's worth noting this isn't just about the big guys. And in some sense, I think this is going to have its biggest effect on the little guys, the people who really need to have every tool at their disposal as they think about how to grow.
Speaking of the big guys, though, I mean, this could be the most critical election in our lifetime if it wasn't the last presidential election. And I'm curious what your thoughts are now on how President Trump, how Biden, continue to reach voters and have their campaigns make an impact. I mean, obviously, we're just seeing so much of Trump right now. And President Biden, Vice President Biden, hasn't been breaking through. What are the chances that he can break through, especially given all of these changes continuing to happen in the digital ecosystem?
I think one of the many problems with the digital ecosystem that we have right now is that it gives an advantage to whoever is the most incendiary, whoever is the most emotional, whoever is the most, sort of provocative. People pay attention to Donald Trump's tweets because they're, in my opinion, nutty, and you pay attention to something nutty in the same way that you pay attention to a car crash as you drive by it. And it's very difficult for people who are urging a certain sense of moderation, people who are urging continuity, people who are urging things like kindness and dignity and empathy. Those are not the sort of grabbiest messages, the grabbiest emotions out there. And the dynamic that we have here in the States is reflected in country after country after country after country. This is something I've said many times. People say that Donald Trump, won the internet. They also say that Modi wins the internet in India, and they say that Duterte wins the internet in the Philippines, and they say that Bolsonaro wins the internet in Brazil. All of these people who happen to be far right, autocratic types, but it could happen on the far left too, are people who sort of had a posture of insurgency against an entrenched elite, and were peddling a message that that appeals to people on Facebook when they can't find it in their local newspaper or their equivalent of cable news, because it's not one that they've heard before. And so I think the problem for Biden, coming back to the United States, is he's not saying a lot of stuff that is shocking. He's not saying a lot of stuff that is hugely incendiary. He's saying a lot of stuff that, I'm a Democrat, but he's saying a lot of stuff that is, that is true and common sense and appealing, but in less of a riveting way than a president who says things that you can't believe the U.S. president is saying. And that's a structural problem that's going to keep him at a disadvantage on Facebook, a disadvantage on Twitter, a disadvantage on YouTube, a disadvantage on all these platforms. And it doesn't have all that much to do with advertising. It has to do with the core mechanics of how the algorithms promote content that's more clicky, that's more engaging, that people share more. And that's a real advantage. Now I think the Biden campaign doesn't need to doesn't need to be in despair about this, because their objective is not to,
Right.
get more Twitter followers than Donald Trump or to get more retweets than Donald Trump. They're out there to win an election. I think the internet realistically is going to continue to be more of an obstacle than a benefit to them. But, that's one they've got to overcome. And I think there are other paths to the White House than just the retweet path that Donald Trump took a few years ago.